The morning Wade Odom's 200 head loaded out. Russell Thornton stood at the fence line where her property met his, both hands resting on the top rail, and she watched without a word. It was October of 2019, and the grass on Wade's side had been grazed to a pale stubble that wouldn't come back strong until the following spring at the earliest. The dirt showed through in patches where the cattle had walked the same line to the water tank too many times. The hoof prints baked hard now in the cold dry of late October. On Russell's side, the paddock behind her held a stand of mixed fescue and clover that came up past the ankle seam of her boot. She had rested that paddock for 19 days. The grass had the deep, specific green of forage that had been allowed to recover its full root reserve before grazing, and the clover was just beginning to flower again at the lower stems, which was the small, visible sign of the soil biology she had been rebuilding for 18 years. Colt, her red heeler, sat at her left heel and watched the trailers the way a dog watches something and has already decided is none of its business. The cattle moved through the chute in a long, bawling line, and a buyer's hand in a yellow vest counted them through the gate with a handheld tally clicker. The smell off the pens was the smell of cold cattle and fresh manure, and the faint tannic dust that came up off the loading pad when the herd was pushed across it. The smell of a working operation in its last hour as a working operation. Russell counted them too, silently, the same way she counted her own at rotation. She had been counting cattle at fence lines for 18 years by then, and she did not stop just because these weren't hers. 200 head, or close enough to it. And before this morning was over, every one of them would belong to someone else. Let me tell you how it got there, and why it mattered, and what a 41-acre spread with never more than 18 cows on it had to do with all of it. Russell inherited the place in the spring of 2001 when Delia passed. 41 acres on the east edge of Canfield County, just south of the county road that ran between the elevator at Milo Junction and the sale barn at Ferris Creek. The land itself was not impressive to look at. The house needed paint. The barn had a soft spot in the roof over the south lean-to that Russell patched with a rubber mat and 32 screws before the first rain came. The pasture had been run reasonably well by Delia, and before that by Delia's mother, and the fence lines were sound, if not fashionable. What Delia left her, besides the land and the deed and 14 head of mixed-age cows, was a brown spiral notebook filled with 22 years of grazing records. Rest days per paddock, rainfall by week, body condition scores by animal number, conception rates by bull cycle. Delia had divided the 41 acres into 8 paddocks back in 1983 and had moved the cattle through them on a rest calendar that she'd worked out by hand, adjusting each spring for rainfall and forage growth. She called it her rotation, and she called the notebook the book, and she told Russell once, years before she died, that if you watched the grass long enough, it would tell you everything it needed. Russell had watched Delia keep that notebook for 16 years. She knew what the paddocks looked like after 14 days of rest versus 22. She knew which 2 paddocks held moisture a full week after the others dried out. She knew, without calculating it aloud, that the land could carry a certain weight of animal, and no more before it started telling you the same thing an overdrawn bank account tells you, except in grass instead of numbers. She kept 14 cows through the winter of 2001 and into the spring of 2002, and by fall of 2002 she had culled 2. Both older cows whose conception rates had slipped 2 cycles running. That left her 12, and she let the remaining 12 tell her what the land could hold. Now, if you want to understand what came next, you need to know who Wade Odom was. Wade ran the operation on the north quarter of Canfield County, that his father had built in the 1970s, and he ran it the way his father had, which meant more head every year, more leased pasture every decade, and a working relationship with a lender in Ferris Creek that he treated the way most men treat a handshake with a cousin, familiar, casual, and never quite examined. Wade was not a bad man. He was confident in a way that comes from never having been substantially wrong about the thing you know best, and what he knew best was how to grow a cattle operation by the numbers his father had shown him. Square footage of pen space, price per hundredweight at the sale barn, feed conversion on a dry lot ration. He knew those numbers the way a card player knows the deck. What he did not know, and what he did not think was worth knowing in 2003, was what Russell Thornton's 41 acres was quietly beginning to prove. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 2003 when Wade said the first thing he ever said to Russell about her operation, and he said it at the counter of Millard Feed and Supply in front of 4 other men who had all come in for one thing and were now staying for something else entirely. Russell had been asking about selenium boluses for a heifer that had been slow to cycle, and Wade had come in for a custom mineral mix. He heard her describe the herd, and he turned from the counter with the easy confidence of a man who considers himself helpful. 12 cows, he said. He said it the way you'd say $12 for a steak, which is to say with no cruelty, just a scale that the number obviously failed to meet. On 41 acres. Russell, sweetheart, you can't make a living at 12 cows. You need to be running 40, minimum. Russell accepted the selenium boluses from the man behind the counter and paid with a check and said, "I appreciate it, Wade," and meant neither agreement nor disagreement, just that she had heard him and was done talking about it. One of the other men, a dryland farmer named Hector Raines, who ran corn ground 2 miles west, watched her walk out and told Wade he thought she seemed all right. Wade said she was a fine woman who'd had a hard year and needed a hand getting her feet under her. He believed it completely. That was the thing about Wade. He was never performing when he was wrong. He was just wrong. Russell drove home and walked the paddocks and looked at her grass the same way she had every morning that week. And she did not think about Wade. She thought about the rest schedule and about whether the south paddock needed another 6 days before she rotated into it. She crouched at the south fence line and pressed her flat palm into the canopy and read the resistance the way Delia had taught her to read it. And the resistance gave her the answer before any pencil and paper measurement would have. She decided it did. If you want to understand what the next 8 years looked like from the outside, here is the picture. Russell Thornton, alone on 41 acres with 12 cows and eventually 18, driving a truck with 240,000 miles on it, patching her own fence with wire she bought in 100-pound coils, no hired hand, no tractor newer than her own age, no social media presence, no sign at the end of her lane. What the waiting list looked like from the inside was different, but we'll get to that. By 2004, she had rebuilt Delia's 8 paddocks into 10, stringing 3 new cross-fence lines herself with a come-along and a post-pounder. She set the cedar posts in the tractor-mounted auger she had borrowed from her neighbor west of the road, and then tamped the spoil back in by hand with the heel of a shovel, the dirt going dark and damp around each post in a clean, small ring. She drove the 3-point T-posts in between with the post-pounder, the steel ringing dull at the first stroke, and going clean and high by the third, when the post had set deep enough to take the wire. The 2 additional paddocks let her extend the rest intervals to 22 days on average, and by the summer of 2004, her forage stood measurably taller at rotation than it had when she'd taken over. She noted the measurements in the notebook. Pencil, same column format Delia had used. She had also started selling direct. A woman named Patty Kessler, who taught third grade at the Consolidated School in Milo Junction, had asked her at the hardware store in 2003 whether she sold beef by the quarter, and Russell had said she wasn't set up for it but would think on it. By the spring of 2004, she was set up for it. Patty was the first customer. Her neighbor across the road was the second. By the end of 2005, Russell had sold out her entire annual cull and finish weight to 11 households and had 3 people asking if she'd have any available the following year. She charged fair prices, not premium prices with a story attached. Fair prices for beef that had never seen a feedlot, that had been finished on grass that had been managed to hold its nutritional density from May through October. By 2007, her customer list had grown to 19 households, and she had started keeping a separate page in the back of the notebook for people who were on a wait, people who had asked and been told that she would reach them when she had capacity. Then 2008 arrived, and with it the kind of summer that teaches a certain kind of lesson in a certain kind of way. The drought that came through Canfield County that year was not the worst in county records, but it was the driest consecutive stretch from June through September that anyone under 50 could personally remember. The dust hung in the air over the county roads from late morning through evening, the heat coming up off the gravel in waves, the cottonwoods along the creek bottoms going early yellow at the leaves a full month before they should have. Russell carried a bandana in her hip pocket through most of July and August because she could feel the dust on the inside of her teeth by the end of any morning that took her past the loading pen. The grass in the overstocked pastures around the county went dry and short by mid-July. Hay got expensive. Grain supplement got expensive. The cattlemen who had been running their places at high stocking rates spent the late summer buying and feed at prices that took a measurable bite out of any margin they had held going to the year. On Russell's place, the rested paddocks held. The ones that had been given their full 22-day recovery came back from the drought stress faster and held moisture longer at the root than the surrounding bare ground. She did not buy a single bale of purchased hay that summer. She reduced rotation speed slightly through August, rested her highest-performing paddocks 10 extra days, and watched her 12 cows come through the summer in condition. She made a 2-line note in the notebook about the soil temperature differential she had measured between her rested ground and the adjacent leased pasture Wade ran his cattle on. 11 degrees Fahrenheit cooler at 4 inches. She had taken the readings on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August with the soil thermometer Delia had bought in 1997 from the Extension Service catalog, and she had taken them 3 feet inside her own fence line and 3 feet outside it in matched pairs at 4 locations along the run. The numbers were what they were. The grass that grew above them was what it was. Wade spent just over $9,000 on supplemental grain and emergency hay that summer, by his own account later. He broke even on the year. Russell made money on the year. She did not say this to anyone. It was not a thing she thought about saying. The following years went quietly, which is to say they went exactly as they looked from the outside, which is to say that from the outside they did not look like much. She added 3 breeding cows between 2009 and 2011, taking her to 15 head, then added 2 more by 2013 to reach 17, and by 2015 she was running 18. 18 was the number she had arrived at by watching the paddocks in their driest weeks of August, reading the forage density against Delia's old baseline measurements, and deciding that 18 was the load the land wanted to carry. Not 19, 18. By 2013, the waiting list had grown to 24 households. By 2015, it had reached 31. She kept it in the notebook, same format, same pencil. The pencil was a yellow number 2 she sharpened with a small folding knife, rather than a sharpener, the way Delia had sharpened pencils, the wood curling off in long, thin shavings that landed on the kitchen floor and that she swept up before supper. First name, last initial, phone number, year added. Some of those households had been waiting 3 years. They waited because there was nothing quite like it available in the county, and because the people at the front of the list had told the people behind them that it was worth the wait. Russell sent each new household a single card with her name and a phone number, and the date she expected to be able to fill their order. She did not have a website. She did not have a business name. She had the notebook. Now here is where Wade comes back into the picture, and here is what he had been doing with the same years. In 2012, Wade borrowed against his equity and took out a USDA-backed operating loan to expand to 200 head, running them on a combination of his owned ground and leased pasture across 3 separate parcels in Canfield County. The operating line ran to $240,000 that first year, covering the additional livestock purchase, feed contracts, and lease payments. His lender in Ferris Creek, a man named Gary Stoll, who drove a truck with a chrome package and a matching trailer that he used twice a year, told Wade that the margins on fed cattle were favorable and that the operating structure was sound. Gary said this because he believed it, which is also what he had believed in 2007. By 2014, Wade was running 200 head at full capacity, leasing a total of 480 acres across 3 parcels, and carrying an operating debt load that had grown to approximately $310,000 by the time the second significant drought in 6 years hit the county. Wade did not know yet that it was going to matter. At the Canfield County Fair in August of 2015, in the livestock barn between the breeding stock display and the junior exhibitors' pens, Wade Odom said the thing he would later wish he could take back. Russell had her 2 best cows entered in the breeding stock class, not for the ribbon, but because Karen Pruitt, the county extension agent who had been watching Russell's records since 2011, had suggested she enter them to establish a documented performance baseline. Karen was the kind of extension agent who wrote things down and meant it when she said she was interested. She had come over to Russell's place twice in 2011 and twice in 2012 and had sat at the kitchen table with the brown notebook and asked careful questions about rest intervals and forage measurement methods, and what she wrote down afterward stayed in her working files. Wade was in the barn with 3 men from his end of the county, including Hector Raines, who ran the dryland corn ground, and a pair of brothers named Tull, who leased pasture from a family trust and had been expanding their cow-calf numbers on borrowed operating capital the same way Wade had. They had been talking prices and fall feeder weights and the cost of the last round of dewormer. And when Wade saw Russell bringing her 2 cows through the barn gate with a lead rope in each hand and Colt staying close at her left heel, he said it without hesitation and with the full confidence of a man who had been running 200 head for 3 years. "There she is," he said to the men beside him, loud enough to carry to the next row of pens. 31 people on a waiting list for 18 cows. You know what that's called, Hector? That's called being full up at a bait shop. Doesn't make it a fishing operation. The men beside him laughed, and one of the Toole brothers, the younger one, laughed a beat too long before he caught himself. Karen Pruitt, who was standing 8 feet away reviewing the entry paperwork on a clipboard, heard every word. She noted it the way she noted everything, which was quietly and without fanfare. Russell walked her cows to their assigned pen, tied them off, checked their water, and did not turn around. If she felt the remark, she gave no sign of it that anyone in that barn could have read. She had been feeling remarks like it, in one form or another, since the Tuesday morning at Millard Feed and Supply in 2003. She had made her peace with being misread by men who measured operations by the pound of cattle on the ground. She had also, by 2015, made approximately $490,000 in direct sales off those same 18 cows, accumulated over 11 years of patient rotation and direct market pricing, and she had not spent much of it on anything that was visible from a road. Here's what direct sales off 18 head at approximately $1,400 gross per animal per year over 11 years actually looks like in plain arithmetic. Not all 18 head every year, because she was building the herd through 2013. Call it an average of 15 head per year across the span from 2004 through 2015. That is approximately $210,000 gross across those 11 years. Operating costs on a managed grass system, with no feedlot, no purchased feed in normal years, and no hired labor run lean. Russell kept her costs close, reinvested in fencing and soil amendment, and paid her land taxes and utilities from the operation. She bought wire and posts in bulk in the spring and fall when the prices were softest at the Supply in Ferris Creek, and she carried the rolls of wire to the truck herself in the same pair of leather work gloves she had been wearing since 2007, and resoling at the palm with a leather patch and a curved upholstery needle whenever the wear came through. The land itself was paid for. Delia had owned it free and clear, and Russell had inherited it the same way. There was no mortgage to service. There was no operating loan. Every dollar the operation turned over was either spent on the land or kept. She also had not told anyone what was in her savings account, because no one had asked in a way that required an answer. The years between 2015 and 2019 were the years that settled the question Wade had been asking with his whole operation, whether he knew it or not. Feed costs climbed in 2016. Lease rates on the 3 parcels he was running came up at renewal. The Ferris Creek lender revised the operating line terms upward in 2017, adding 1.5 points to his carrying rate in response to market tightening. What had been a workable margin at 200 head-on favorable terms became a narrowing margin at 200 head-on revised terms, and a narrowing margin on a $310,000 operating debt does not narrow slowly. It narrows the way a gate closes, steadily and then all at once. Wade sold 60 head in the fall of 2017 to reduce the debt service. He sold another 40 in the spring of 2018. The operation that had been 200 head in 2015 was down to 100 head by mid-2018. And the parcels he had been leasing were going back to their owners one by one as the lease renewals came due, and Wade could not cover the rate the land was bringing on the open market. Gary Stull, the chrome truck lender from Ferris Creek, had been replaced at the bank by a man named Terrell, who wore the same kind of suit, but had a different set of instructions about the acceptable carry on an operating loan showing that level of principal and that thin a margin. Hector Raines heard from the Tull brothers that Wade was in some kind of renegotiation with the bank in the spring of 2019. The Tull brothers were in their own negotiation by then, though they were not telling Hector that yet. The information moved through the county the way information in rural counties does, not fast but thorough, reaching every kitchen table eventually. Karen Pruitt had been tracking it the way she tracked most things, which is to say with her clipboard and her working files and the calm, accumulating attention of a woman who had been watching agricultural decisions and their outcomes in Canfield County for 16 years. She had also been watching Russell's records update year by year in the brown notebook at the kitchen table on the east end of the county, and she had started, by 2018, to think about how you would describe in an extension report what the difference between those two operations actually measured. The dispersal sale was set for the third Saturday in October 2019. Wade had held on as long as he could, which was considerably longer than some in the county had held on, and that was not nothing. He was not a man who quit easily. He had worked every angle he had, and in the end the arithmetic had worked every angle back, and the arithmetic had more angles. There were approximately 40 people at the dispersal sale, including buyers from outside the county who had heard, through the market network, that the cattle were in reasonable condition and the terms were cash. Russell had driven over not because she had any intention of buying, but because she had watched this story for 16 years, and she thought she owed it something, attendance at least. She parked her truck outside the fence line and walked to the rail with Colt at her heel. The grass along the access road was brittle and brown, and the kind of late-fall pale that meant a freeze had been through the night before. The wind was out of the northwest at a steady 10 miles an hour, with the iron smell that came down off the high prairie when winter was deciding to commit. Russell kept her hands in the pockets of her insulated coat and watched the loading the way she watched anything she could not change. Karen Pruitt was there too, standing near the scale house with her clipboard, because she was Karen and she went where the data was. The cattle loaded through the morning. Wade worked the chute himself the way he always had, and he knew every animal by number, if not by face. He worked without much talking, which was not how he usually worked, and the men around the chute gave him the room to do it without commentary, which was how people in that county treated a man doing something hard. The chute gates clanged in the cold, with the particular flat ring that loading pen iron took on when the temperature was below 40, and the diesel of the haul trucks idling at the lane sent its blue exhaust low across the dust before the wind lifted it up the line of cottonwoods at the section corner. Russell watched from the fence rail. She did not count aloud. When the last trailer closed its gate, and the sound of the cattle settled, and the dust in the loading pen began to fall back to the ground, Wade walked the length of the fence to where Russell was standing, and he rested both hands on the top rail the same way she had, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Colt sat between their respective boots and looked at the empty pens. "Russell," Wade said. His voice was level but quieter than his usual register, the way a voice gets when there is not much left underneath it. "How many you running these days?" 18, she said. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when a number confirms something he has been doing the arithmetic on for a while. "And the waiting list?" 31, she said. Wade looked at the empty pens for a long moment. "I said some things," he started. He stopped. He looked at the ground on his side of the fence, which was bare and packed from years of traffic. "At the fair. And before. I was." He stopped again. "I was wrong about the numbers." It was not a complete sentence. It was close enough. Russell said, "I know," and she said it without satisfaction, just as a plain statement, because she did know, and because it was over, and saying more than that would not have made it any better. Karen Pruitt, standing 12 feet away near the scale house, heard both of them, and she wrote a single line in her notebook, not for the report, just for herself. Wade sold the land he owned outright the following spring and retired to a smaller place north of Milo Junction that his sister had been renting. He was not ruined exactly. He was reduced, and he knew the difference between the two, and he did not pretend he didn't. He was also, for the first time in 20 years, free of a $310,000 operating line. And there was something in that, even if the way he got free of it was not what he had planned. 2 years after the dispersal sale, in the fall of 2021, Karen Pruitt published an extension report on per-acre net returns from alternative beef production systems in Canfield and the 2 adjacent counties. She had been building it for 3 years, and it was not a long report, just 12 pages with 4 tables. But the figures in the 4th table were specific. Among the operations she had tracked with sufficient longitudinal data to establish a meaningful baseline, one showed a documented per-acre net of $184 annually, averaged across 10 years on 41 acres, on a direct sale managed grazing system with no external labor and no purchase feed in non-drought years. She did not name Russell in the report. She coded the operation as Site 4C, which was the notation she had been using in her working files since 2011. Anyone in Canfield County who had been paying attention already knew. The people who had not been paying attention read the table in the 4th section and did the multiplication, and then had a different kind of conversation at the feed store counter than the one that had been going on there for 16 years. $184 per acre per year on 41 acres was $7,544 net annually. That was not a large number taken alone. Taken over 20 years, on land that carried no debt and required no lease payment and no operating loan, with a direct sale customer base that had been generating its own renewal for 15 years, the number was a different kind of picture entirely. The land itself, appraised in the spring of 2023 at $6,800 per acre, carried a total value of $279,000, free and clear, for a woman who had started with a brown spiral notebook and 14 head of mixed cows and the specific knowledge of what a paddock looked like after 22 days of rest. By the spring of 2023, Russell was 59 years old and beginning to think about the next thing. Not retirement in the way of stopping, but transition in the way of passing something carefully to the right hands. Her knees had been telling her things for 2 years that she was mostly ignoring, and Colt was 11 and slowing down at the heel but still working, and the operation was as healthy as it had ever been. The waiting list stood at 31 households. The land stood at its full 41 acres, every paddock tight. The notebook had been joined on the kitchen shelf by 3 additional notebooks of the same brown spiral type, filled in the same pencil, same column format, the record unbroken from 1983 to the present day. Lena Marsh had come to Russell's attention first at the dispersal sale in 2019, where she had stood on the buyer's side of the scale house and watched Wade's cattle load out with the expression of a woman doing arithmetic on a problem she could not quite afford to solve yet. Lena was 28 at the time, the sole operator of a 12-acre market garden on the parcel adjacent to Russell's east fence line, raising her daughter alone on what the garden and a part-time bookkeeping job in Milo Junction brought in together. She had been watching Russell's paddocks from her own side of the wire for 2 years by then, and she had asked Russell one afternoon across the fence whether the grass on the rested paddocks was a different variety or just managed differently. Russell had invited her in and shown her the notebook. That had been the beginning of a 4-year conversation that was unhurried by both of them, and moved only when it was ready to move. Lena had read the notebooks, all 4 of them, at the kitchen table over the course of several visits in 2020 and 2021. She had asked good questions, the kind of questions that came from someone who had been thinking about the answers for a long time before she asked them. By 2022, She was helping Russell with fence maintenance on the south paddocks and learning the rotation schedule from the inside, walking the paddocks with Russell on rest day measurement mornings, feeling the grass density the same way Russell felt it, with the flat of the hand and the eyes reading the color of the canopy. She was not being paid for this. Russell fed her lunch, and occasionally her daughter as well, a 7-year-old named Ada who took a strong interest in Colt and had no fear of the cows, which Russell considered a reasonable qualification for someone who might one day be managing them. In the spring of 2023, Russell typed a 1-page lease agreement at the kitchen table on a second-hand printer that took 3 attempts to produce a clean copy. The first attempt had gone through with a banded streak across the 3rd paragraph because the toner cartridge was running low on the side that took the most use. Russell shook the cartridge twice the way she had been taught to shake it by the man at the office supply in Milo Junction, ran a cleaning cycle, and tried again. The second attempt was streaked at the bottom margin. The third attempt was clean. She held it under the kitchen lamp and read it twice for spelling and once for tone, and only then did she lay it on the table beside the brown notebook and pour 2 cups of coffee. The lease offered Lena 10 acres of the east side paddocks at $180 per acre per year against a county average lease rate of $260, with a first option to purchase those 10 acres at the appraised rate within 5 years. Included with the lease were 12 cows from Russell's current herd, the founding stock of what would be Lena's own rotation. Lena read the entire page twice and then looked up. "Why 180, she said. Not as a complaint, as a question that wanted an honest answer. Russell said, "Because that's what the land needs to be worth to you at the start, not what it's worth to me." Lena signed the page. Then she sat with her hands on the table for a moment before she said, "I don't know if I can do this." Russell said, "You know more than you think." It was not a speech. It was 2 sentences. But it was also the same thing Delia had said to Russell, in different words, at a different kitchen table. And Russell had been carrying it for 22 years. She slid the oldest notebook across the table, the one from 1983, Delia's original. She did not explain what it was. Lena had read it already and knew. She kept her hand on it for a moment before she let go. Outside, the east paddocks were 2 days from rotation. The fescue and clover mix was exactly at the height Delia's original measurements had marked as peak nutritional density. The same height Russell had been reading for 22 years. The same height Lena had been learning to read for 2. 18 cows moved in a loose line along the cross-fence wire in the next paddock over, waiting without urgency for the gate that would open in 48 hours. The cows knew the schedule, the way Russell knew the schedule, by accumulation, by repetition, by the small daily practice of a system that had been running on its own measure since before any of them had been born. The lead cow, an 8-year-old with a half-blackened ear from a wire snag the previous winter, looked at Russell across the wire and chewed and looked away. There were 31 households in the county who would get a call in the fall when the beef was ready, most of them people who had been on the list for 2 or 3 years, some of them for longer, all of them waiting without complaint because the people ahead of them on the list had told them it was worth it. Russell would fill 20 of those orders this year off her own herd. Lena would fill the first 3 off hers. Colt walked to the back door and lay down on the mat there, the same mat he had been sleeping on for 4 years since the arthritis in his hips had started making the truck seat an effort. He was 11 years old, and his muzzle had gone gray from the nose back, and his pace had dropped from a working trot to a steady walk, but he still made the rotation rounds with Russell every morning, and he still sat at the fence line when there was something worth watching. The kitchen lamp was on over the table. The 4 brown notebooks were on the shelf. The lease was signed and set aside. The land outside was doing what it had been doing since 1983, which was resting and growing and telling anyone who knew how to read it exactly what it needed. The grass on the east paddocks was ready in 2 days. The fescue heads stood at the height Delia's first measurements had marked. The clover was at flower. The soil under it carried the same 11-degree differential it had carried since 2008, when Russell had pressed the thermometer into the ground at 4 inches and read what the rotation had built. It always was.